Good evening, everyone. My name's Emma Dawson. I'm Executive Director of Per Capita, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to this Zoom conversation about how early childhood investment in early childhood education and care can power our economic recovery, brought to you by the good folk at Essential Media and the very important new campaign Thrive by Five. I will shortly introduce our guests and our discussion for the evening, but I'd like to start by acknowledging that I come to you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I know you'll join me wherever you are in whatever country you're joining us from in acknowledging that we are all on the lands of the traditional owners, Aboriginal land which was never ceded. We are recording this event this evening, so please bear that in mind. It's going to be uploaded online later and we're live streaming to Facebook. So please be respectful and try not to say anything in the chat or in the discussion that you wouldn't say in a public forum. We do encourage you to keep your video on. We found it does add to the sense of being together and in a real in-person event almost that Zoom facilitates if we can see one another. If you're on a computer or a laptop, you can set your screen to gallery view by clicking the button in the top right-hand side, and then you'll be able to see everybody. There is a chat function, so please use it to ask questions or make a comment. In fact, if you'd like to jump into the chat right now and introduce yourself to one another, that'd be great. And I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the conversation so that we can have a good discussion at the end of our hour together. Everyone's muted, but if we do call on you to ask a question, an admin person from Essential will unmute you. We do encourage people to use their full names, and if you're representing an organisation, please include that in your name. And finally, if you're having any technical issues, just private message our tech support person in the chat as well. So I'm really thrilled tonight to be joined by three leaders in the area of early childhood education and care. Firstly, of course, Jay Weatherill. In March 2004, as a state member of Parliament, Jay was given ministerial responsibility for South Australian families, and 2 months later, his first daughter, Lucinda, was born. In the years since, the coincidence of those two events, early childhood development has remained a focus of Jay's personal and professional life. As Premier of South Australia, he supported the development of more than 100 centres for early childhood development and parenting across the state. These centres are designed to provide integrated services and support highly qualified practitioners seeking to connect families with the latest evidence-based understanding of early childhood development. He's also advocated for systems change through the COAG process and now through through his role as CEO of the Thrive by Five campaign. We're also joined this evening by Helen Gibbons. Helen's the Executive Director of Early Learning at the United Workers Union, which represents many early childhood education and care educators across the country. Helen spent 20 years working as an early educator herself before taking on a leadership position in her union, and she works closely with members to drive change in the early education sector. And finally, Peter Dawkins. Peter's been Vice-Chancellor and President of Victoria University since January 2011. This follows 6 years in high-level leadership roles for the Victorian Government, including as Secretary of the Victorian Department of Education and Early Childhood from 2006 to 2010. He spent 28 years altogether in the university sector. Peter's a regular contributor to policy debates in the area of education, especially tertiary education. He recently wrote an opinion piece in the Australian Financial Review on his views of early childhood and its potential economic impacts. Peter was awarded an Order of Australia in the 2017 Queen's Birthday Honours List for his outstanding service to tertiary education as an administrator and an academic. So as you can see, we have some really fine minds here with a lot of experience from different sectors to contribute to our important conversation about the role of early childhood education and care. I'm going to kick off with just a little outline. Excuse me, I don't have COVID, but I do have what has been a nasty cough, so I'm still a little bit croaky. I will kick off by just taking you through some of the economic issues around the current debate around early childhood education and care and the investment or lack thereof that we see for this important sector across our country. Just before the federal budget last month, I published through Per Capita a paper entitled The Case for a Care-Led Recovery. And within that paper canvassed some of the key issues around early childhood education and care and what its investment could provide for our country. I think it's really important to note that Australia does pretty poorly by international standards around our investment in the ECEC sector. And I'm going to use that abbreviation rather than say early childhood education and care every single time. We are below the OECD average in terms of the amount of money each year that we invest in the sector. And it was about $8 billion last year. Those countries that have really first-class early childhood sectors, such as Sweden, Denmark, France, Korea, outstrip us by a factor of almost 2 to 1. We also have amongst the highest household costs for early childhood education and care in the OECD, the 4th highest, in fact, after only New Zealand, the UK and the United States. It's over 30% of average household income that goes to early childhood care. And that is a significant barrier to parents' workforce participation. And we also know that given the recent changes in the activity test and so on that were introduced a couple of years ago, it has resulted in some of the most disadvantaged children, those that would most benefit from an investment in their early years, missing out. In fact, as a recent report by my friend Danielle Wood at the Grattan Institute showed, for parents who would like to spend more time in the workplace, almost half of them cited the biggest barrier to that, to achieving that ambition was the cost of childcare. But the inaccessibility of early childhood education and care in Australia not only limits mainly women's, but all parents' capacity to work as many hours as they'd like outside the home, it has a detrimental impact on children's development. And Jay will talk about this at length. But I know that the data that his campaign has been promoting shows that over 1 in 5 Australian children now start primary school with some sort of developmental delay. And almost again, 1 in 5 centres across Australia that provide early childhood learning and education don't meet the current national standards of quality standards. We also have a lower rate of kindergarten attendance for 3 and 4-year-olds compared to the average in the OECD. Almost twice as many Australian children miss out on that essential early learning as they do in comparable developed nations. And we know that investing in children's early education in those early years before the age of 5 is the single biggest thing we can do to promote equality across the life course, to ensure that all children are able to reach their full potential and to have the same opportunities that children from more advantaged or certainly wealthier backgrounds have. In fact, data put out, I think, about 6 months ago by the Front Project showed that for every $1 we invest in early childhood education and care now, we get a $2 return over that child's lifetime. Now, these economic arguments are important because, unfortunately, if we can't demonstrate the economic benefit of things, then we tend not to get much attention at the federal level. But it's also simply the right thing to do. It's the best way to encourage children to thrive, to reach their potential to live happy, fulfilled and meaningful lives. It makes for happier families. It makes for greater social cohesion. And as we know, as any parent of young children knows, when they come home from those first few days or weeks at childcare, as we used to call it, in their early learning centres, the leaps and bounds that they make in their understanding of the world, in their social connectedness, and in becoming their own person is really quite stunning. So it's a really important campaign that Thrive by 5 has kicked off. And I'm, as I said, really thrilled to have 3 experts in this area here to talk with us tonight. I'm not going to carry on much longer, although I will be managing the Q&A later on. So as I said, do put any questions that arise during this conversation into the chat, and we'll make sure that you get the opportunity to have your say. But now I'm going to throw over to Jay Weatherill, who's going to outline the campaign, what the key focuses are, and also what the focus on federal and state budget asks and the positions that we need for early learning and to really bring us up to world-class standard will be. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Emma, for that excellent introduction, and welcome everybody. And I come to you from the land of the Whadjuk people and the Noongar Nation here in Perth in Western Australia. Well, for all the reasons that Emma's just said, there's an imperative to put the early years on the national political agenda. And what we now know about the critical importance of those first 5 years and the profound impact it has on really all of the important things in life, the health, the learning, the well-being trajectory, And for those people that are concerned about some of the challenges that we face in public policy, whether it be mental health, the child protection concerns, drug and alcohol abuse, the chronic disease burdens, or indeed if you just look more broadly at the question of disadvantage, the distribution of opportunities and income in our community, just about on every measure that you could imagine, investing in the early years is a profound part of the solution. And so we've known that for some time, but there's a massive gap between what we know and what we do as a community. We don't conduct ourselves as though these first 5 years are the most important years of the lives of our younger citizens. We don't respect the people that actually provide the services and the support and the education for children during that period by having some of the lowest paid and the most insecure employment for the educators that work with those children. We don't support the parents who are conducting this most critically important role in the lives of our younger citizens by ensuring that they get all of the support they need in an easily accessible way. We place one of the largest burdens of any comparable country in the world, as Emma's just told you, on families the very time in their life when they're undergoing some of the greatest challenges, that is bringing up these children. So at a time in their life when their incomes are going to be typically lower, when they're going to have a whole lot of other cost burdens through dollars going out the door with mortgages and things like that, we at the same time have all of the burden of essentially the early learning and the costs of our early learning system falling most heavily on them. And we know what pressure does to families. We know what financial pressures does to families and the stress that puts families under. So we don't conduct ourselves as a society in a child-friendly way. And this has profound impacts for the way in which our children develop. And it also has profound impacts, as Emma's told you, for our economy, not just for the workforce participation of typically women, but also, probably and most crucially, the general level of capability of our citizens. So the jobs of the future are not going to be the process jobs of the past. They're going to be jobs that require the very skills and attributes which are laid down in those first 5 years, the executive functions that give you the capacity to organise, the capacity to think through problems, the capacity to build relationships, the capacity to control your emotions and deal with stressful circumstances. All of those executive functions are laid down in the first 5 years. So the way in which we assist and support our children and the quality of those early experiences and the absence of negative experiences is profoundly going to shape the general level of capability of our citizens and therefore the future prosperity of our nation. There could not be a more important public policy agenda. This, in our opinion, is the next great social reform. We've reformed our healthcare system. We've got a high quality universal healthcare system. It could be improved, but it's a great system. We've got a great education system. Once again, it could be improved, but it is a great education system. But the first 5 years, we don't even have a system, and it certainly isn't supported in the way in which it needs to be. This is the next great public policy reform. So this becomes the campaign goal of Thrive by 5. So how are we going to achieve this goal? Well, what we know is there are many people on this call and many others that have worked in what we could broadly describe as the sector which supports early learning. And that can be what we often call the ECEC system, the early education and care system, sometimes called childcare, but also has other systems like infant and maternal nursing, child protection, preschool, and of course the broader family and community services, without even considering all of the health and allied health services, paediatricians, allied health professionals, speech pathologists, etc. So many people across all of these sectors that involve themselves in the lives of children and families in the first 5 years. But with all of those people and with all of their expertise, they are not strong enough as a group to permit us to win a campaign of this sort and put this issue on the national agenda. They're necessary. That group needs to come together and campaign, but it is not sufficient for us to win a campaign. So we need to broaden out our coalition. So how do we do that? Well, we have to speak to the broader group of the Australian community. And we believe that there are three key narratives which are crucial in mobilising that support. And it's worth saying that where we start is not necessarily where this campaign is going to end. This campaign will change over time as we seek to build these coalitions. The first critically important narrative is about the way in which a child's brain develops. And people might think they understand how children develop in the first 5 years, but when they're given the story of a million neural connections occurring every second when children have high quality early learning experiences, it completely opens their minds to how valuable and important these years are. And you cannot have these experiences unless parents are supported and given the information that they need to be the best parents they can be. And you also cannot provide this support unless you have high quality, well-paid, respected practitioners, early educators that are providing this support. So that's the first narrative, one about the way in which a child's brain develops. The second narrative is a narrative around cost of living. And as you've heard Emma said, about 30% of young families' income are disappearing in childcare costs, one of the highest proportions in the world, and it is putting a massive burden on those families. And this is a very powerful motivator for those young families, many of whom who live in outer suburban areas, in the very seats which make and determine election results. This is a massively important constituency to mobilise. And thirdly, another critically important constituency to mobilise is women. The current system of early education and care discriminates against women in a way which means that they cannot offer themselves for the amount of work that they might otherwise do under a different system. Essentially, we have a system that punishes you for additional work. If you want to work more than 3 days a week, you essentially lose money by going to work. That holds many women back. It is women typically who are the second income earners, sometimes men, but 90% of the cases it's women. And that is the effect that has on the household income is affecting the second income earner's decision. And this very powerful economic imperative, which is estimated to cost the Australian economy in the order of $27 billion per annum if it could be remedied, is a very powerful, not only economic argument, but a very powerful argument about the life opportunities of women and the discrimination against them and their future earning capacity and their ability to participate in the life of the economy. So those three narratives, not separately but together, are powerful. Each reinforces the other. It's not sufficient to say this is good for the economy if it's not good for children. It's not sufficient to say in terms of our political power to just simply talk about children. But together, these narratives provide a very powerful coalition for change. And so that's what we're encouraging people to do. Join, as the banner behind me suggests, thriveby5.org.au. If you go there, there'll be a supporter journey that will take you through how you can participate in this campaign and how we can together put the early years on the national political agenda and deliver the next great social policy reform in this nation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. And I do encourage all of you, we will put links in the chat throughout the evening, but to jump onto the Thrive by 5 website and sign up to the campaign. If you haven't already, there are some really terrific resources available and coming through regularly already. I'm going to ask Peter Dawkins now to speak to you. As I outlined, Peter's got long experience in the field of education, and he's going to talk a little bit about his view of the economic opportunity that investing in early childhood education offers us, particularly in the context of our national recovery from COVID. Thanks, Peter.
Well, thanks very much, Emma. And let me start by congratulating Jay and Thrive by Five for really working very well to put this issue really back on the national agenda. I think it's a terrific initiative. I've been asked to talk as an economist, as well as being Vice Chancellor of Victoria University. I'm a Professor of Economics, as well as being a former Secretary of the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development in Victoria. I was before that a Deputy Secretary in Treasury in Victoria. And when Steve Bracks and John Brumby were leading the state, and they took an agenda to COAG back at that time about investing in human capital. And I was very much engaged in the analysis involved in the investment in human capital that was needed for the future economy and, of course, the future society. And early childhood featured very prominently in that. And COAG did do some important things that progressed our policy in this area. But it's my view that we now need another big push on investment in human capital, and early childhood needs to be at the forefront of that for a number of reasons. Look, I do have a few slides that I'm going to share with you. Hopefully you can see that one, which is the cover slide, which I've called this presentation Quality Early Learning and Rebuilding Our Economy. And you can see that I've made reference to the Mitchell Institute there, which is at Victoria University, which is doing a lot of research in this area of early childhood and education in general. And I have colleagues present tonight, I think, from the Mitchell Institute and also from the Centre of Policy Studies that does economic analysis of important issues, including education and early childhood. And Emma mentioned that recently I wrote an article in the Australian Financial Review which argued the case for a human capital reform agenda as we come out of the COVID-19 recession. And I'll just take you through the logic of that. And the first couple of points there are really a repetition of what Jay was saying just a little bit earlier. Australia will need to increasingly rely on its human resources for its future well-being. And in the post-industrial age, most people will need what Jay called these executive capabilities, problem-solving skills, interpersonal skills, and so on, to be successful in work and in life. And reform is needed at every level of education and training to enhance our human capital, early childhood, schools and tertiary education. And I think the urgency has been increased by the COVID-19 recession and the unemployment that's associated with that. And but it needs to start with better early childhood development. As Jay also said, over 20% of children are developmentally vulnerable when they enter primary school. And that imposes a huge challenge for the rest of the education system. And I think that however much we invest in the school system, until we can get children entering school without as much of these vulnerabilities, then it's going to be hard for the education system to achieve the outcomes for our young people that will stand them in good stead in the 21st century. And so this investment in early childhood development will filter through the whole education system in terms of its impact. An added advantage of a well-funded universal early childhood system would be increased labour force participation of parents, especially women. And also investment in early childhood will assist the recovery from the recession, including as a major employer of a largely female workforce that's been significantly impacted by the recession. So I've bolded some things there really to emphasise, I think, some key points that A, we need to enhance our human capital. Early childhood development has a very important part to play in that, and investment in that will lead to improvements in our long-run growth potential for our economy. But it will also have the impact of increasing labour force participation of parents and also enable increased employment, particularly of women. So that was the argument I put forward in that article. Just in the next slide, I just want to say something about the contribution I guess economists have made to putting the case forward about this investment having a strong return. We do know, as Jay so accurately described, we know increasingly more about the impact on brain development of early childhood, of high quality early childhood development. And this does lead to a high return on investment in this area, especially for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, who are the ones that tend to be most developmentally vulnerable. And pleasingly, quite a lot of economists have done some really good research on what those returns on investment are. And I've just quoted a few studies there, and I won't go through them all, but there's a British study there, which I thought was particularly important back at the time I was looking at this, when I was Deputy Secretary of Treasury back in 2005. And then more recently, there's James Heckman there, a Nobel Prize winner, who's shown in his research a 13.7% lifetime return on investment of a prototypical early childhood program in the US, and a high benefit cost ratio. And then in Australia, we've had this study for the Front project by PwC that finds that under the current Australian system, for every $1 invested, the return is $2. I also have mentioned a study there by Yiping Seng and others. Yiping, a former colleague of mine from the Melbourne Institute, who's still there and doing great work and maybe with us tonight, that's been looking at evidence from an Australian randomised control trial, particularly around children at risk. So there's no doubt that those most developmentally vulnerable children are the ones that gain the most from this kind of intervention. But I think increasingly there's an understanding that we need an improved sort of universal system with additional support for these developmentally vulnerable. Jen Jackson, who's well known to many of you, has summarised a lot of the policy implications of this PwC work in an article in the conversation. Emma, I think in her introduction, explained very well how we stand internationally, which isn't all that favourably when you compare how much we invest in Australia compared to other countries. It's not all a bad story. We have increased our investment over time, and that particularly goes back to those reforms we did back in the early part of the century. But it is true that that you can see there that a lot of the increase in spending has had to be by families, and the burden is more considerable than other countries. And there you can see in that next slide that an Australian family with two parents on average full-time wage spends approximately $6,000 on childcare. It's more for those on high wages, less for those on low wages. And government, this is roughly matched by government spending. And 87% of the support of government is in the form of childcare subsidies, and the remainder in the form of early childhood education provision. And as Jay said, you know, the Thrive by 5 campaign has pointed out that in the second dot point there, this is one of the most expensive systems for parents in the OECD. And then the other point he pointed out was that we've got a fragmented system and it needs to have more coherence. And I guess particularly between child care and preschool, but then there's also child health, family support and child protection. So we need a more coherent system and one that is less expensive to parents and more universally accessible. So that's, I think, the plan that we need: an easily accessible university early childhood development system with an overlay of more intensive support for more developmentally vulnerable to enhance our human capital, but at the same time, develop an industry, if you don't mind me calling it that will employ more people in a very gainful cause, and also have the added advantage of increasing labour force sophistication. And Janine Dixon, one of my colleagues at Victoria University, has recently published an article that shows that this kind of investment will produce an economic growth dividend that largely covers the cost, because more than 900,000 Australians with unpaid caring responsibilities would like to have more hours in paid employment. And so when we do make this investment and we release parents from responsibilities from excessive responsibilities of parenting, it boosts the labour force in a way that will significantly boost our GDP and help pay for the costs of this investment. So finally, this is the last slide I'm going to share with you, just to I guess plant a few ideas about what kind of reform are we actually talking about here, because we want a more universal system with the additional overlay for disadvantaged children. But it seems to me there are three ways of thinking about this. You could implement incremental reform with our system that is a bit fragmented, to say the least, which could involve increased childcare subsidies, reduced extent of means testing. It could increase the minimum number of hours of early childhood education that are funded by government for 4-year-olds, extend it increasingly to 3-year-olds and younger, do some early childhood education workforce development initiatives. So that's the kind of the incremental approach. The most radical, more comprehensive reform, I guess, would treat the funding of early childhood education share more like the support for primary schools, so that there's access to universally directly funded early childhood education and care, and while at the same time providing additional support for more developmentally vulnerable. And obviously this needs to be fully costed and cost benefit assessment made, and we have a good framework that PwC has developed in that project, where they've got that 2-to-1 benefit cost ratio that we can adopt and adapt for this kind of comprehensive reform and do the cost benefit analysis. It needs to be informed by an international review of different approaches and their effectiveness. The OECD has in the past come out with the view that this direct public funding model tends to have advantages in terms of scale, better quality, more effective training of educators and so on. But it is a very big reform that may be challenging to implement, has some obstacles in the way, lots of federal state issues, and probably the most expensive approach. So that does raise the question, is there a middle way? Balancing multiple forms of provision, recognising, of course, these multiple productivity contributions that come from early childhood development, parental labour force participation, and of course, we need to develop the workforce as well. But driven by a case for a quantum leap that moves us away from the kind of fragmented piecemeal approach to a more systematic approach supported by all levels of government with greater coherence. So it seems to me that is an important discussion to be had as we move forward with this agenda, and ultimately, we do have to identify the particular reforms that are needed. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Peter. A really comprehensive and compelling overview of the various arguments, I think, and the issues that need to be considered as we seek to make meaningful reform. There have been a few comments and questions in the chat about the role of the workforce in this sector, so I'm really pleased that we've got Helen Gibbons here tonight to talk to us about that. I've reflected, Helen, in a number of forums now, and including a chapter for a book that I edited on Reconstructing Australia, which Jay contributed to, that the one big thing that this COVID-19 crisis has shown us is who are the really essential workers in our society. And of course, early childhood educators are right up there in that respect. So Helen, can you tell us a little bit about that, that crucial role that educators play in delivering a high quality system for children, and the opportunity, I think, that we see for employment growth in this sector, and the benefits that holds, not just for the workforce, but also for families and for children themselves.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to everybody tonight. I want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I'm on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, and specifically I'm in Redfern today, which has often been the centre of Indigenous struggle for recognition and rights. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So following on from Peter's discussion, I'd like to say that I'm very firmly in the campaign for big reform and not incremental reform. And one of the key areas that I want to talk about tonight is workforce, which I think will only be solved by big reform. And incremental reform isn't going to solve the issues that we face with workforce. So I'm going to talk about early educators and specifically why any vision for a universal early education system needs to include a vision for how we support, recognise and value early education, early educators. Not just because that's what's fair, and frankly it is fair to value them properly, but because we really can't deliver what we want to deliver without them. And I've broken down what I want to say into kind of 4 headings, and I don't have slides, but I've got 4 headings. Who are they? Why are they important? What's the problem and what shapes the problem? So first off, just a really quick snapshot of who they are. There's nearly 200,000 early educators in Australia, and about 120,000 of them work in long daycare. And long daycare is my primary focus, but there are many different streams to early education, including kindergartens or preschools, family daycare, and other different forms of accessing early education. But my primary focus and what I'll really be talking about tonight is long daycare. There was about 7,500 long daycare settings across the country, with about half of those settings being for-profit. And that for-profit ranges from private equity to listed companies to sole traders. It's a really disaggregated market. It's got thousands of employers. So this is not it's not one beast, it's lots and lots and lots of different beasts. 97% of the workforce is female. And anyone who works in the early education sector or works in early education is qualified. It was one of the questions in the chat about qualifications in early education. All of them are qualified, or they're actively working towards a qualification. But those qualifications range from a Cert 3 to a diploma to a degree qualified. And there's been over many years an increasing push to raise those qualifications. And that's gradually seeing a really significant shift in the sector, with about half of the workforce now holding at least a diploma. The workforce is booming. The workforce is expected to grow by at least 20% over the next 5 years. And there's been a really significant growth in workforce over many years now, and it's created significant stresses and strains. So that's a little snapshot about who they are, but why are they important? Well, I think Jay and Peter have both touched on this. The key driver of quality early education programs and great outcomes for children is all about workforce. The people who deliver that early education are absolutely key to quality early education. Research shows that those early educators need to be experienced, they need to be qualified, they need to be consistent, and that matters, that you have consistent educators. Ongoing close relationships between children and educators and families are absolutely key, and they matter. And this is skilled work. And I shouldn't have to say this, but it is not intuitive. It is skilled work. It is skilled work that you can get wrong, and children in high quality early learning do better, and children in low quality early learning do worse. So it is important that we get it right, because it has a real impact on children. So what is the problem? So the problem is that there is a crippling workforce shortage of early educators, and that shortage is getting worse. A study from a few years ago now found that 37% of early educators intended to leave their job within the next year. And that is double the national workforce turnover stats. And it's even worse in rural and remote areas, where the people are saying that they intend to leave within the next year rises to 45% of all early educators. And these stats are pre-COVID stats. And I believe that the workforce crisis will really escalate next year. Early educators have had a horrible year. It's been really tough, and many of them are exhausted and they're disheartened with the way that they have been treated through this pandemic. They've been essential workers, but they haven't been treated as essential workers by this government. And every time an early educator leaves the sector, a trust relationship between an educator and a child and an educator and a family ends, and it has to be rebuilt with someone else. And that has a very real impact on children and families. And when those educators leave the sector, the investment that they and taxpayers made in their qualifications, well, that leaves too. And then centres face the enormous costs of recruitment and inductions and training, and taxpayers have to fund the delivery of more qualifications, all in this endless quest to keep topping up the leaky bucket of workers in the sector. This churn is costing taxpayers and employers and families, and most importantly, children. And so my next heading was, well, why? Why does all this happen? Many things impact an educator's decision to leave. Most educators love the work that they do, and they're extraordinarily committed to children and families. That's why they do the work that they do. And it's a stressful job, and it's got enormous responsibilities. Educators deliver educational programs with minimal paid planning time available, very low levels of professional development available in paid time. They're frequently working from home and upskilling on the weekends and in the evenings. But the absolute largest cited reason for wanting to leave the sector is their pay. Educators can earn as little as $22 an hour, with hourly rates rising with their qualifications, but even at the degree level, they'll earn a third less with exactly the same qualification working in a school. It's not that educators don't want to stay in the sector, it's that educators can't afford to stay in the sector. And educators' wages are trapped between government funding that is inadequate to properly value them and no one wanting to drive up the cost to families. So in summary, we don't just need a system of early education that allows people to work and builds our economy. These are really important things. But we need a system of early education that delivers great outcomes for children. And we need to be careful that we're not sacrificing the quality of early education provision for the quantity of early education provision. Quality matters. And we know that consistent, experienced, qualified educators are key to delivering that quality. We also know there's a shortage of early educators and that churn is costing the taxpayers money and it's costing children dearly. We know why early educators are leaving. Addressing professional development and planning time will help, but it won't fix the underlying issue. The underlying issue is that the interplay of government funding, the costs to parents, and in many cases profits, are working to suppress educators' wages, and it's that that's driving educators out of the sector. So I'm very firmly in the big reform camp because a redesigned universal system has to address this issue or fail on every single measure that we put to it. And I could go on. I haven't even touched on why early education is so undervalued, and I haven't waxed lyrical about the role of for-profits in the sector, but I'll park all of those for another session. I just really want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. And I think that we've got a really clear vision about what we want to achieve in this sector. We've just got to make sure that we are addressing the issue of workforce to really deliver on what our vision is. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I think it is an absolutely critical part of the conversation. And I'm going to just throw a few ideas in for us to discuss now as a group before I take some questions from the chat. But I'd like to actually, you said you'd park that issue about for-profits and related issues, but one of the policies, of course, that was taken to the last election by the ALP was a direct intervention to increase the wages of early childhood workers. And it kind of overshadowed the other element of that package, which was making early childhood education and care more affordable. And we've seen that, a recommitment to that from the Labor Party in their budget reply to that part, but nothing on the wages question as yet. And I think that's partly because it was badly received, certainly by a lot of economic commentators at the time. I was one of the few that comment on these issues to say, well, this is an instance of market failure. The market fails to adequately value the work done by these skilled educators. And in an instance of market failure, it's the role of government to step in and correct that market failure. And I remain firmly of that view. How do we get that back on the agenda, not only with the current government, but with the opposition between now and the next election? Because as you rightly say, and I'd welcome Peter and Jay's thoughts on this as well, until we do fix that issue, we're going to continue to see qualified early childhood educators leave the system for the primary school system because their work simply isn't valued adequately by the market system in which we operate.
Would you like?
Oh, I'll just leave
Helen first, perhaps.
Peter, but I just say it's one of the reasons I and my members are really excited by this campaign, because I think it re-enlivens that whole debate about the market failure. If there was another way, we'd be happily embracing it, but we think that direct intervention is the way to deliver it, because it's the only way to not just drive up parent fees. But I'll throw to Peter and Jay. I'm sure that they've got insights too.
Jay, what's the Thrive by 5 view on this question?
Well, it's simply that you can't have a high quality system unless you have properly remunerated, qualified and supported educators. And I think it relates to the first narrative about how children's brains develop. I mean, there's a myth that children can't learn or don't learn until they go to school. And there's another myth that, if you change their nappies and let them play and leave them alone, they'll have a happy, healthy development. We now know it's actually much more complex than that. It's the sophisticated interaction between play-based learning and the way in which their brains develop. And parents can be supported to understand that. And, some of us do things, almost out of instinct with children, which we now know have got quite a profound neuroscientific basis for the why they help a child develop. But I think as people begin to understand the difference between high quality and low quality, they will come to respect the skills and capabilities of educators, and then begin to understand how crucial it is to attract the very best people into the sector, or retain the best people in the sector, so that we can retain those relationships. Helen made a really important point about relationships. Almost all of everything we can find about what high quality services look like really is about both the skills of the practitioner, but also the relationships that are formed between the family and the service, but the practitioner in particular. So these are highly interrelated issues, the ability to attract and retain a high quality workforce, their actual interactions with children, but also the connections they make with families, so that those families continue to involve themselves in these sort of trusted services.
Thanks, Jay. And Peter, I'm going to get your views on this as someone with an economist perspective, but also ask you to comment on another question that's just been posed in the chat from Des Griffin that's related to this, which is, how do you respond to the argument that making early childhood education a universal government-funded service means that well-off families will end up getting taxpayer funds? Because the two things are related, aren't they?
Yes. So let me take the workforce issue first. It seems to me that if you treat that issue in isolation, then it's a difficult argument to win with government, but it has to be part of an integrated story of the kind that Jay's talking about, where you kind of lead with the importance of high quality early childhood education and care. And as we can present the narrative about the return to the economy and the society of a greatly expanded and higher quality early childhood education and care system, then I think the logical analysis will flow through to the implications for the labour market and for the needing to invest in the higher quality workforce. So it's sort of taking the high moral ground, I guess. Look, I think on this universal question, I think really the analogy with primary schools is quite helpful here, whether or not we end up with a funding model that's like primary schools. Do people really question whether or not universal primary education is a regressive thing and increases inequality because higher income people get access to that system? That argument, you don't basically hear that argument because every child needs a high quality primary education, and the evidence now is clear that they need early, high quality early early childhood education and care. And therefore that does lead you logically to a universal system. I think you know, the economists would then say, well, you treat distributional issues as a separate issue. And if you think you've got you know, an unequal, the society is too unequal, or you're expending too much on high income families, then you deal with redistribution in different ways. You don't use the education and care system as a redistributive mechanism. That would be the economist's view.
Yes, and a very good view it is too, and a correct one, I think. I'd just like to point participants to some work. Peter, you mentioned earlier Janine Dixon's work in this space, your colleague. I think she's on the call, but I haven't been able to contact her via the chat. But I'm just going to post in the chat a link to the National Foundation of Australian Women's annual gender lens on the budget from this year, because Janine provided some really important modelling on the economic return of investment in the care economy as a whole. So not just early childhood education and care, but care across society. And I think the important thing to bear in mind there is not only the return on investment for children as they move across the life course, but the immediate return in terms of the employment growth, the closing the gender employment gap and the gender pay gap, and critically that these jobs in care are the fastest growing part of our economy, and they're also jobs that aren't easily automated out of existence. So investing in care, there was some work done by the Women's Budget Group in the UK that demonstrated this, and Janine has replicated some of that modelling slightly differently for Australia that shows the return is actually quite impressive. So the economic argument really against doing it is rapidly deteriorating, I think. I'm going to go back now and take a couple of other questions, mindful that we've only got a few minutes left from throughout the chat. And I noted we've got some, now Janine is here. Janine, do you want to unmute yourself and just very quickly tell us in a much more coherent form than I'm able to with my shocking head cold exactly what your research found? Can we unmute Janine Dixon, please?
Hi, can you hear me? Hello. Well, I wasn't expecting to speak, so you've caught me post-running, flushed, and also in the middle of cooking dinner. So I'm actually living the working parent dream. But yeah, so the work for the National Foundation for Women, specifically what we looked at was the ABS Barriers to Labour Force survey identifies 900,000 people who care for either children, the aged or disabled, also identify that they'd like to work more. And about half of those are people who are caring for children under the age of 5. So that's 450,000 people. So we did the modelling, and we came up with the we said if those people were just able to work an extra 10 hours extra a week, so a modest amount, just 10 hours a week, and if that was to be facilitated by access to care for either the aged or disabled or the children, that would add about 1.6% to GDP by 2030. And not only that, but that it would practically pay for itself, because once those people enter the workforce, they start paying income tax, they consume more, so they pay more GST. The states are able to collect more payroll tax. So what we find is that the net cost to the government is very, very low. So there's really no strong economic argument not to do this. There's no argument that says, oh, look, this is too pricey. You know, it imposes too much of a cost on the public purse.
Thank you, Janine. I do highly recommend having a look at that modelling. It's an incredibly useful piece of work, and thank you for doing it and for speaking on an impromptu basis too.
Yeah, thanks, Janine.
Terrific and very important research, which I'm
not always this red in the face.
We're all doing the best we can in COVID Melbourne. I'm also going to call upon, and thank you for your quick comments there. I'm also going to call upon Eva Cox, who's with us. Can't possibly go past some comments from Eva, who's been an advocate in this space now for as long as I've been alive, I think, well, over 50 years, so even longer. And Eva, you made some comments earlier in the chat that I think are really important about the importance of early childhood education and care to us as communities of people, and how we're losing some of that community aspect. Can you reflect on that for us quickly, please?
Yes, I mean, I was involved quite a long time, as I say, trying to get the funding up, and we actually managed to get the ALP to fund it under Hawke. And what we were trying to do then was really integrate early childhood services as part of local community services, which meant they connected up with all of the other services, the healthcare and other things. And parents felt that they actually had an ownership sense. They felt that that it was part of the support system. And I think and you actually could get your child in without having to get a certificate saying you were an incompetent parent if you weren't working. And that really affected the people that are most uncomfortable about having their child labelled, and that involves a lot of Indigenous communities and a whole lot of other people, if they're not, not working, not in the paid workforce. And we've lost that in a hell of a lot of areas. I mean, we've lost it to some degree with the change that we have in the non-government sector as well, because I just think childcare is an essential part of community, and it needs to be seen as a community service. It's not as a financial services. I am concerned at the fact that neither Peter nor Jay actually addressed the issue of the expansion of private care, and a lot of sympathy with Helen's view that, that there's a serious problem when you've got a lot of overseas investments where you've got these people tied into contracts and various other things, and it's actually been shown that the competition idea of competition cutting costs doesn't work. This comes out the Fin Review, an article I read, because people are tied into into a contract, which means the lower the level of, if there's too much competition and they drop the number of children, they are tied up in having to pay a certain amount back. So they have to raise their fees rather than drop their fees when more competition comes in. So it doesn't even work to drive prices down.
Well, can I ask then that, because we are running out of time, can I get both Peter and Jay to comment, to respond to that issue?
Well, yes, I'm curious to know why the Thrive by Five ever mentions the issue around privatisation.
I'll let Jay have first response to that then.
Well, I suppose we're trying to build the broadest possible coalition for change first, and so what we're trying to do is to focus on arguments that build that coalition, not necessarily break it apart. I've got some sympathy.
maybe in that you're undermining it. Yeah.
Well, but perhaps hear me out.
I'm sorry. I just
I think the starting point really is to begin with arguments that are able to build the broadest possible coalition for change, and that's what we've done. We've tested these arguments. We're trying to create the case for change, I suppose, in the broader community. I think that there's a certain sort of inexorable logic. If you have a universal system that's fundamentally funded by the Commonwealth or by any state public purse, it becomes, I can't imagine that any public entity is going to tolerate too long the overwhelming, a large proportion of that going into profits or to rents. I mean, there's a sort of an inconsistency, if you like, between a universal system that's fundamentally funded by the Commonwealth or the states and actually that money disappearing into the private for-profit sector. And I suppose the other element of our system design, which we think is crucial, and you've really touched on it, Eva, is this notion of connected community services. So I have difficulty imagining a sort of a neighbourhood community service that's run for profit and also has room to integrate all these other not-for-profit or government services, it's unlikely that you'll see a private for-profit business do that, because if there's a community need, instead of responding to that need, it's more likely they'll also have the profit motive in mind. So there's, while we're not directly saying there's no place for the private sector, it's hard to imagine in a universal model of the type we contemplate that there seems to be an inconsistency with it. But our first, I suppose we've been trying to spend most of our time seeking agreement about the things that are wrong with this system. And what we've been trying to do is steer clear of system design issues at this early stage. And the reason why we want to steer clear of system design issues is that we don't want people pulling apart our campaign on the basis of the details. We're trying first to get there to be a wide acceptance that there's a problem that needs to change, focusing very much on children, families, and also the broader community. So that's the explanation for why we don't dwell on the system design issues at this stage.
Thank you very much, Jay. We have hit the end of our time, but I'm just going to indulge a couple of extra minutes to get some final comments from Peter and then from Helen before we wrap up. Peter, can we try to keep a minute or two, please?
Yes, look, I did delve into some system design issues just to, I guess, foreshadow the kind of discussion and debate and analysis that will have to happen in due course. And I think that the more you move towards a comprehensive universal system, and the more you promote high quality early childhood education care, the more challenging it will be for the market design to include for-profit private providers in a big way. And look, but I think that those system design issues will become extremely important, and they're ones that naturally interest me, I guess, as a policy maker and as an economist. And I think that that issue, Eva, is one that will need to be addressed. But I think Jay's way of getting this debate going is exactly the right way forward. And it's been a pleasure to be involved in that discussion tonight.
Thank you, Peter. I tend to concur that once we've got the settings of the system we want right, then certainly the profit gouging operators will flee anyway. Helen, final thoughts from you?
I think this is a really exciting initiative, and I think what's exciting is not just the narrative, and I think that we're all in furious agreement about the narrative, but what's exciting is the broad church that it's bringing together. And many of us have been campaigning on talking about improving early education for many years, but we haven't always sat alongside each other or spoke with one voice or worked together cooperatively. And to be able to do sessions, like I was at the launch, where it's not often I get to do a session with Julie Bishop and John Hewson, to have a broad church of people, whether they're from the progressive side of our world or whether they're from the more conservative side, but to actually all have the same agenda and all have the same outcome in mind, and trying to find a way past our differences and focus on the outcome, because that's what children need us to do. I think it's really exciting. So really glad for the opportunity to talk to everyone tonight.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jay. Thank you to the team at Essential, and thank you all of you for joining us here tonight. I do recommend that you jump onto the Thrive by 5 website, sign up for the campaign. Also check out that important work by Janine Dixon. I've posted shamelessly a link to my own recent report on the case for a care-led recovery, and we'll continue to do work in this space at Per Capita. I'd also like to acknowledge Travis McLeod from the Centre for Policy Developments here tonight. CPD do some fantastic work in this area as well. There are a lot of us that really feel passionately about this, and it really is bringing together, I think, a broad and impressive coalition of people that can hopefully make real change and get to the point where universal access to quality early childhood education and care is regarded by the Australian people as inviolable as Medicare or our public school education system, and something that it will be a real bedrock of our future prosperity and health and happiness as a nation. So thank you so much for joining us. Keep an eye out for future Thrive by 5 events and also for future Per Capita events. And I hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you. Good.